Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at Joint Special Operations University. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOW network. Please keep in mind that the views and the opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsow@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon or good morning, Mark. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And so, today I wanted to have you on to discuss your article, Intelligence Is as Intelligence Does. As we discussed before, I came across the article in 2018 and found it very valuable. And I've used it in all of my courses since discovering it. I think it's particularly useful since most of the students I teach are what I call practitioner scholars. So mainly military professionals, some national security professionals. And I always find that they come to the class with kind of a belief like, I know what intelligence is. It's what the J2 does. It's what the G2 does. That's intelligence. And I think your article does an excellent job grappling with that and really raising the question, what is intelligence? And I found it very useful for particularly the practitioner, especially in this time as we're moving from the past 20 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global war on terrorism, where I would argue we've kind of defined what intelligence is based on that experience. Mm-hmm. And now we're going into something new. And so today I was hoping you could, provide us a little insight in what led you to this article, and then just discuss the article with us.
Sure, happy to. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Before I sort of get into that, I should say you keep talking about my article. It was half my article. I co-authored this with Dr. Mike Warner, who had a long career as a historian at the CIA, and then was the DNI historian for a while, and is presently the historian at U.S. Cyber Command, and is very interested in questions of intelligence theory. Whereas I come from this of more of a, let's jump into the archives and let's look at the, the nitty gritty of what intelligence agencies actually do. And through different directions, we'd both become very interested in this question of what is intelligence, which, as you mentioned, sounds like a perfectly straightforward question. It's what the J2 does. It's what CIA does. What are we talking about here? But the problem is that if you look around the world, and if you look throughout history, and just, relatively recent history, 20th century history, even for that matter, post-World War II history, you find that lots of different intelligence agencies around the world, agencies that we would call intelligence agencies, there doesn't seem to be ambiguity about this, do all sorts of strange things that US intelligence agencies don't necessarily do. They've run soccer teams. They've been the place where you would register births and deaths. They've built roads for many years. One of the big functions of Israeli intelligence was to help resettle Jews who were living in dangerous places outside Israel to Israel. They've run newspapers. In fact, Stars and Stripes originally actually was published by the American Expeditionary Forces G2 in World War I. They've done all kinds of things. They run prisons. They run all kinds of things that to us don't sound like intelligence functions. And we looked at all the various definitions that have been offered in the literature of what intelligence is, including one quite well-known one by Mike Warner. And none of them really actually seem to fit when you broaden your lens out and start looking at the diversity of sort of global practice. And so we got to thinking about this and so what's going on here? And ultimately, to sort of, put the bottom line up front, the conclusion we came to was that the concept of what intelligence is has been sort of constructed over time, that there's no a priori, definition of intelligence. There's no strict ontological category that you could say, if you're in this box, you're intelligence. If you're outside this box, you're not intelligence. But what has happened is that over time, a core of sort of related functions that tend to have to do with there are exceptions to all of these, but tend is actually an important word here, tend to have to do with either military affairs, diplomatic affairs, or security within a state, and that tend to be associated with secrecy, have sort of clustered together. And today we would argue there are a set of core functions that are generally recognized around the world as intelligence. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that all intelligence agencies do them, but that people in intelligence agencies, pretty much anywhere you go, would recognize, yes, these are intelligence functions. So those would be things like intelligence collection. Right? And not all agencies do intelligence collection. I mean, just think in the United States, for instance, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, where I worked for several years, doesn't collect, but those people all know that collection is part of intelligence. So intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, counterintelligence, and covert action, which is, a whole other problem that maybe we'll get into a little bit later. But generally, we would argue that around the world, it's agreed that those are sort of core intelligence functions, even if not everybody does them. But at the same time, there are all sorts of ancillary functions that in different times and different places in different countries, intelligence agencies can take on. Some of the ones I just mentioned, of, building roads and atomic bombs and being the registry for births and deaths and all those sorts of things. And those are very much more sort of idiosyncratic, dependent on, as I say, the time and the place and the particular leadership. Usually, again, not always, but usually they tend to have something to do with, those factors I mentioned before: military, diplomacy, security. And it's been a case, these are typically cases where whoever's in position to make these decisions, whether it's an agency chief or a president or a prime minister, whoever says, I need thus and such done. Who in my government, what agencies in my government have the right skill set to be able to do this thing? And if the best fit seems to be intelligence services, which is often the case if these things involve secrecy, right? One of our core competencies is keeping secrets. We're really quite good at that. Then, those functions might get sort of, okay, you, National Intelligence Service, you do this thing, even though it doesn't seem to have much to do with collection, analysis, counterintelligence, covert action. And so you have all these ancillary functions. And then over time, around the world, if more and more intelligence services seem to be, repeatedly getting assigned some particular ancillary function, maybe slowly over time, those can migrate into and become core functions. And we argue actually that there's one of those current core functions, covert action, where in the grand scheme of things, historically, relatively recently, that process has happened, and that's covert action, right? That covert action, something approximating the ways we understand it today, was largely an invention in World War I. And I say invention in World War I in the sense that that's when it started to be things done by intelligence agencies, as opposed to, oh, it's a military function, or a foreign ministry will hire somebody to engage in some skullduggery on a one-off basis. And it started in World War I. It started to get institutionalized in intelligence agencies, precisely because, and here we're following an argument made by a scholar named Mark Cornwall. They looked around, hey, we need to subvert the Central Powers, particularly Austria-Hungary. This needs to be done secret, otherwise the subversive messages we're trying to convey aren't gonna have credibility with our audience. Who's good at doing stuff secretly? The intelligence services, right? And then really during World War II and after, in the Cold War, this really got solidified. And so, but if you look back in the 19th century or, back farther in time, the things that we might recognize as covert action weren't intelligence functions. They weren't necessarily at all being done by the spies, right? So that's one that we think has moved from being a peripheral and ancillary function into being a core function. And we can see some others that, might be coming down the road that arguably might be, if we were having this conversation, I don't know exactly, 50 years from now, maybe 25 years from now, might be generally seen as core functions. We may want to go into more detail on some of these, but one I'd immediately point to is clandestine diplomacy, which is quite commonly done by intelligence agencies when two countries need to need to get together to talk about something, to negotiate something, but it would be politically embarrassing for them to be seen publicly doing that. Often that function of clandestine diplomacy gets given to intelligence agencies. So we argue that that's one function that maybe is in this process of slowly migrating into the core. But the long and the short of this then comes back to the title of the article. There's no a priori definition of intelligence. Our more or less global, very, very rough working definition has been built up by practice rather than by some, preset concept. And it evolves over time. So intelligence is whatever intelligence agencies are doing. So now you don't need to read the article.
Well, one of the things you mentioned in the article and you just mentioned now was the importance of secrecy. So what secrecy provides, my understanding on the early days of the Cold War, when the CIA, kind of adopted foreign intelligence collection and covert action, a lot of that had to do with, one, other agencies didn't want to do it. Two, there was an element of secrecy and deniability. And so it seems to me in the argument, it is really providing that capability of secrecy to the decision makers is what the intelligence community, its main value or most significant value.
I would say maybe not main value, but it makes particular services that the intelligence agencies are able to offer, more appealing. That's not a very good way of putting it. But I guess I would say, look, intelligence agencies are not the only government agencies that do things secretly. They do things secretly on a routine basis, right? I mean, militaries, right? You don't publish your war plans in the newspaper, right? Much of diplomacy, much of law enforcement, just to begin with. It's just that more or less everything, not quite, but darn near everything intelligence agencies do is secret, number one. And number two, we like to imagine, and I, as a former intelligence officer, think it's true that on average, we've got the particularly sensitive secrets, right? So we're really good at this. But there are other agencies that do secret things, and that therefore, often can be plausible alternatives for some of these ancillary functions. President says I need X done. Who's going to do it? Well, intelligence agencies might have the right skill set because this involves secrecy, but gosh, maybe the military. Maybe I could give it to the military. And if you look in the real world, and we're probably best familiar with the United States government, right? There's all sorts of competition around the edges, if you will, of intelligence, right? So even if you go back to those, just those bread and butter core issues, so intelligence collection and intelligence analysis, right? Lots of government agencies collect information and analyze it and come to analytic conclusions and then convey those conclusions to, their general or their secretary or whatever it is. And sometimes when you look in the nitty gritty, it can be really hard to distinguish, well, is that intelligence or isn't it? And so one example, they became quite politically controversial, of course, was after 9/11, when, the question arose of what connection, if any, was there between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Al-Qaeda, right, in the run up to the Iraq War. And the CIA and the quote unquote intelligence community were basically, slightly oversimplified, pretty darn skeptical of any important relationship between the two. But a policy shop was set up in the Pentagon under the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy to look at that same raw intelligence reporting, which they had perfectly legitimate access to, and to come up with other conclusions, which the Defense Department, and I think to some degree the White House, used in just the same way that they would have used a briefing paper from CIA or DIA. But it wasn't intelligence because it wasn't being done in an intelligence agency. I mean, another example that's actually even sort of one step removed, much of what places like the Rand Corporation or the Institute for Defense Analyses or CNA does, much of that, if it was done by DIA, we'd say, yep, that's intelligence, and they wouldn't think twice about it. But IDA and Rand and CNA, they're not intelligence agencies. They're not even government agencies. So there's contested borders here around intelligence, which gets back to this notion of there's not a God-given definition of intelligence.
So basically, it boils down to if intelligence is in your name, your title, your organization's name or title, I should say, and you do something, whether it's building roads or it's covert action, it's intelligence, right?
Yes, which I know sounds a little weird, but we thought about this long and hard, and it's kind of where the logic led us.
No, but I although it seems weird, and we want this nice, clear, clean cut definition, and like you, I grapple with all the time, and especially when you're teaching intelligence. Yes, it's easy to say intelligence is information enabled decision making. But like you point out, I've in my non-intelligence background, I've done the same thing. I enabled decision makers as part of a staff, right? I did my own research, I did my own analysis, I made recommendations. And so, and then when I look at, you brought up covert action earlier, and if you look at covert action and then sensitive activities that the military conducts, many which people don't think of as intelligence, maybe intelligence enabled, but on the surface, they look very similar. And, one is considered intelligence, I would argue, and one's not.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I may be slightly oversimplifying, and maybe I'm even being a little cynical here, but to my mind, and I'm not an expert in military, sensitive activities here. That's much more in your bailiwick. But as an informed outsider, much of the difference seems to boil down to who do you have to ask for permission, and who are you subject to oversight to, right? Which committee in Congress are you subject to oversight under? But that's neither of those kinds of things are differences about what's actually going on the ground, right? It's about the permissions and the oversight and which legal framework are you operating under. And I think that leads to an important point, sort of broader point, is that the United States is unusual. I'm not going to say unique, but is unusual in the degree to which it puts formal institutional sort of procedures and parameters and whatnot around legal parameters around covert action, right? In the United States, for instance, it is not a covert action unless and until the president has signed a finding, right? Well, I don't know of any other country that has such a requirement. There may be analogous requirements, but it's certainly not universal, right? And in fact, it's not even universally the way the United States did covert action, right? That's been since what, 1974, if I recall correctly. But if there's no finding, it is not a covert action. That's not, it's legally important. It's important from a policy perspective. As a citizen and as a taxpayer, I'm very comfortable with that, but it's not a substantive sort of component of a definition of an operation, right? And not all countries operate that way. A lot of places, a lot of countries around the world, if they want to do something that to us would look like a covert action, maybe only the intel agency chief needs to sign off on it. Maybe not even that, right? They just do it. All sorts of differences about process, which to us as Americans, we tend to foreground when we're talking about covert action. Well, covert action is this set of processes. The military has a different set of processes. And so what they do is not covert action, even though down at where the rubber meets the road, it's the same darn stuff. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like to me, the definition of intelligence is also a living thing. As you pointed out, our culture, the year of intelligence affected how we perceive stuff. The Church of Pike Committee hearings affected how we perceive covert action and stuff and processes. And it makes me wonder, and you highlight this in the article, and and I would say you highlighted it before it became kind of the flavor of the day. But you and Michael Warner were talking about like forecasting to the future, about how will our definition of intelligence evolve, and what I perceived as calling in one hand the gray zone, or what I would say is the topic du jour right now, this strategic competition.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get your insight on how we consider, think about intelligence change as a strategic environment changes.
Yeah. Well, as Yoda said, always in motion is the future. So, I'm cautious about predicting the future, but I would say that, we saw at least three different functions which plausibly might be in the process of migrating to becoming core intelligence functions. One of them I've mentioned already, which is clandestine diplomacy. One of them also that seemed likely is, it'd be hard to sort of put my finger on exactly what about it, but things related to cyber. And the third one is sort of this, all these stuff that goes on in the gray zone, and these, the shadow warfare kinds of things. I think are very plausibly moving into that realm. And I would say, in support of that claim, that there's a lot of intelligence agencies around the world where doing that sort of stuff is already bread and butter for them. I'd point you to the Russian GRU just to begin with. Frankly, they might say the same thing about the CIA. I'm not sure. And actually there's some roots to this, right? I mean, I didn't mention it previously, but one of these ancillary functions that some intelligence agencies have had, which is certainly not a core function presently, but it is not unprecedented for intelligence agencies to have special forces, right? Like special forces that would look like, Rangers or, special mission units or that sort of thing, like things that you and I would recognize as special forces, but they belong to the intelligence agency. The GRU for a long time, and then for a while not, and if I recall correctly, they're back again, right? They own the Russian Spetsnaz, which is an enormous force. Back in the day, the French Sedeki, which was the predecessor to the French DGSE, post-World War II, had the 11th Shock Parachute Battalion, right? That was a part of their agency, right? They can conduct airborne operations. And all sorts of stuff that goes on down in the sort of gray zone conflicts and competition where secrecy is absolutely vital, and that often have as well, are often very much sort of enabled, as you said, by intelligence as well, right? If you need to apply, whether it's force or persuasion or whatever it is in a very precise sort of way, intelligence needs to tell you exactly what button it is you need to push in the target area, right? So they're already wedded intimately with intelligence, which I think is another reason that it's very plausible that 30, 50 years from now, that whatever we're going to call it, but something along those lines will be viewed as around the world as a core intelligence function, because it's already a function of some intelligence agencies around the world. Which I think gets to a broader question, actually, of how to put this, culturally, if you will, what's sort of the reflexive impression that people have in various places around the world as to what intelligence does. Now, as I said, we argue there's these main core functions: intelligence collection, counterintelligence, and covert action. But if you ask Americans or British or Australians or Germans, their answer of what's intelligence for would be something along the, and I think you alluded to this earlier, something along the lines of providing information and understanding for decision makers to make better decisions or to have a decision advantage in a competitive environment. And you can see this in the seal of the crest of the CIA, right? So what do you have there on the crest, right? So you've got a shield, which indicates this is about security. This is about securing the country. And you have an eagle, and eagles are renowned allegedly for their excellent vision, right? And you have a compass rose, right? So the thing that points to all different points on the compass. And so the symbology here is that we are looking with an eagle eye everywhere around the globe so as to be able to help provide security. But but other intelligence agencies and other intelligence cultures around the world don't view intelligence primarily as an aid to good decision making. They view it as a form of power in its own right. Right? And you can see this, for instance, on the seal of the Soviet KGB and its successor, the FSB, right? And what are the two big things there? You have a shield again. So it's about security for the state, but you have a sword as well, all right? The KGB was the sword and the shield of the party, right? This is a metaphor of intelligence as being a thing that allows you to like smite your enemies, right? And defend against their blows. It's not about looking with an eagle eye around the world and knowing everything so you can dominate, the decision-making competition. It's a fundamentally different metaphor. And, the CIA and the KGB both did all those core functions, but the sort of the going in vision, if you will, prejudice, I'll go with vision that they had about what is intelligence for, why is it here, what's its purpose, was really quite different. And you see it's not just with, it's not just a distinction between us and Soviet Union and Russia, right? You see this in a lot of countries in the developing world where, the primary function of the intelligence service is to, sit by the telephone and the president calls and, says, hey, this person, this opposition leader over here is causing me trouble. Will you go sort him out? And they go sort him out, right? That's not the way CIA or DIA or, NSA thinks about their mission. But that's, well, of course, that's the way things work in many countries. That's what intelligence agencies are primarily for in many countries. So
one to protect
start in the same sort of place with functions and go in different directions. I'm sorry.
One, it seems to protect the regime,
Yeah.
and the other to protect, maybe values and principles and national interests, and not, the regime.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good way of putting it. I think that's exactly right.
One of the things I think about, and I completely agree with you that it's squishy, this thing we call intelligence. But here at JSA, one of our things we like to prepare the soft practitioner to do is to operate with their interagency partners. And when there's not a clear definition or appreciation of the other's roles and responsibilities, it makes this collaboration difficult.
Sure.
Right? Like, where does my responsibilities end? Where does collaboration occur? What do they do, for us? What do we do for them? Type of thing.
So we were talking about, you were talking about interagency cooperation and understanding the roles of different agencies.
About interagency cooperation, and it was pretty clear, I would say, to some degree, although there was tension. But over the last 20 years, when it was focused on counterterrorism, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was to enable operations, right? Yep. Now I see the roles and relationships potentially shifting, with strategic competition and stuff. My fear is, with what intelligence, without a clear understanding of what is the role and responsibility of the other, it will affect collaboration, and it could also kind of affect, disagreements over roles and responsibilities. Yeah,
I think that's a very reasonable concern, and as somebody who's spent a good bit of time working not in or for the Defense Department most of my career, I have worked for the Defense Department, but mostly at the CIA or at State Department in my national security life. I think there's many who would already argue that the American sort of intelligence apparatus has been warped too much to being too military focused, to being too focused on support to current operations, in a way that sometimes can certainly leave underserved other important elements of national power. Right? I mean, I think Bob Gates was fond of talking about how money spent in the State Department is gives you a bigger payoff than money spent in the Defense Department. Like the diplomacy is cheap. If that fails, we get to the Defense Department. So let's try and accomplish our objectives there. But they often have very different sort of cultures. Also, places like State relating to intelligence, where I think military folks, uniformed military folks, see intelligence and intelligence, the G2, the J2, the S2, and their staffs as all being sort of much more part of the, integrated in day-to-day operations and day-to-day activities. It's like, yep. and there's less of that sense, I would argue, in the State Department, that intel feels often a little more like some of the other, right? Which I think is one of the reasons that they haven't always necessarily been as effective in fighting for sort of the intelligence support to diplomatic activities that maybe would be wise. But yeah, interagency understanding and communication is always very, very difficult. And I think also that there is a sense in the United States sort of intelligence world that, which I think is only, it certainly flourished during the Cold War when we were worried about, the Warsaw Pacts coming through the Fulda Gap, or worried about Soviet strategic nuclear strike. But I think has taken on new dimensions now since 9/11, of a very, very securitized, even militarized view of intelligence. Right? I mean, these days, if you walk up to somebody on the street who actually reads the newspapers, right, but is not an expert, and start talking to them about the intelligence community, they're going to talk to you about a lot of stuff that's basically related to counterterrorist operations. And you're probably going to hear about, NSA surveillance looking for terrorists, and you're probably going to hear about, alleged intelligence community drone strikes. You're not going to hear, much about the geeky intellectuals sitting at Langley or whoever, trying to discern the latest ins and outs of Chinese foreign policy, or, the Brazilian economic future, or that sort of stuff, right? It's going to be about getting warheads on foreheads, and those kinds of issues is what they're going to think about. And I think that impedes all kinds of understanding as well.
Well, no, you raised something I think that's linked to the intelligence does argument. What I find just through my research and speaking to various elements of the intelligence community, they all many of them, I would say, view their purpose of intelligence and the role of intelligence differently depending on where they sit.
Sure.
So it seems to me,
and does depend on where you sit. There's no question about that. I don't know who came up with that expression originally, but they were absolutely.
And so, I having conversation, I remember sitting at an INSA conference once, and I was sitting there listening to, individuals whose background, human, SIGINT, OSINT, all the INTs, and I was listening to them discuss intelligence. And I walked away, again, now with a clear definition of intelligence. I walked away thinking to myself, we have an intelligence community, and they collaborate, which is good, but they all see the purpose of intelligence and their role as an agency, an organization, or an individual within the organization slightly different.
Yes.
And so it's fascinating, but it makes it difficult for intelligence scholars to kind of understand this thing we call intelligence.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And you also see it within agencies as well, right? I mean, if you have a heart-to-heart with somebody from CIA's Directorate of Operations, and they will, grudgingly admit that those analysts are doing intelligence, but, like real intelligence is, what case officers do. And, that kind of thing, is routine, right? As a former analyst, I would say, yes, everything the collectors do is for the sole purpose of giving me data. So it's all about me, right? So, yeah, where you stand definitely depends on where you sit.
Or OSINT. It took me a while to appreciate OSINT, to be honest with you, because, my mind was, well, it's not clandestinely acquired.
Yeah, absolutely. And OSINT is also another great example of what I was talking about earlier, with intelligence having extraordinarily fuzzy boundaries, right? You look in the Pentagon, you look in the State Department, you look in the White House, and there are all sorts of people and offices doing OSINT, except if they're not in DIA or INR or CIA, like, it's not intelligence, but yeah, actually it is. And then and let alone the private sector, right? Whether organizations are doing it on a commercial basis, or organizations like Bellingcat or Amnesty International, which does some really interesting things with GeoInt, for instance, they're all doing OSINT as well, right? But they are decidedly not intelligence agencies. So yeah, OSINT is a particularly interesting topic in all sorts of ways, I think, with regard to our discussion.
Well, Mark, I really appreciate this opportunity. This has been great. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, I continue to find a lot of value in the article. I think it's very much so for the position I'm currently in, where I work with soft practitioners. I think there's always, as I mentioned again, there's always this kind of, hey, I know what intelligence is. It's what enables my operation, right? It's the two getting up, pointing to the bad guy or the information that's collected so I can take action. And I think, you know, from reading your article, you raise many important points. One, you know, there's activities performed by the intelligence organization that others are doing. On one hand, we call it intelligence. On the other hand, we don't call it intelligence. You know, two, in my mind, it raises, you know, this whole question about the, you know, back to, you know, what it is where you sit. You know, the purpose of intelligence for the operator is oftentimes to enable their operations, or I would argue the purpose of intelligence for policymakers is to give them an understanding of the world.
Yeah, I think that's a much more concise way of putting it. Yes, I think that's quite right.
So, but thank you for joining us, and I'll give you last word for you know, as our guest.
Well, no, I think that's a great summary. I couldn't agree more, and I'm delighted that you found some use, and your students have hopefully also found some use in what Mike and I wrote. You know, as academics, most of the time we're shouting off into the void. So we're always delighted when anybody reads anything we write. So thank you so much for that, and it's been a real pleasure talking with you.